Thank you. My name is Candice Frontier. I work at the district office, and this week I had the pleasure to walk through a school campus where I was with a principal, and she checked in with a student in class. So said, "How are you?" And he said, "Oh, my parents got in a fight last night, and it really sucked." And she just thanked him for doing his best and being there. But I think my heart was just heavy in that moment interaction, and just knowing that I just really value this work and value. I know everyone's busy right now and it's a crazy time, but I think that just continuing to build our skills and our relations with our students and supporting them, supporting the entire whole child, not just academically, but bringing that lens to this conversation, I feel is very key. And when we decided we wanted to do a book talk and we got this book, it was like, hey, I'll just reach out to the author and see if he can meet with us in book talk. And luckily, actually even better, I got rerouted to Miss Denny, who's actually Native Hawaiian herself, who's the founder and CEO of a nonprofit, and can tell us more about her whole story. But I just felt like, wow, this was actually meant to be, that we would actually connect with you. So thank you for joining us today. And I know you're on the mainland in Milwaukee, correct? But I think that it was meant to be.
Yeah. Oh, mahalo, Candice. I also have joining me today one of my support staff, Jo Mckenzie, who's can just bring her energy in before I go ahead and take over on the conversation. So Jo, do you want to introduce yourself?
Happy to. Hi, my name is Jo Mckenzie. I do virtual support services at the HIR Wellness Institute. I do a lot of work with our team members on things like trainings, visuals, documentation, helping support our team in being able to reach out to our relatives and our community members. I'm super happy to be here. I love being able to meet new people and come into new spaces and, hear all our voices and our stories, because they're super important to all the work that we do in the world. So thank you so much for having me. And here's Lea.
All right, mahalo. So I want to, before I begin to share my slides, I just want to share a little bit more about who I am and my story. I was born in San Francisco, ended up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin because of my mom, who brought me out here some years ago, many years ago, actually. And my grandfather was born on Wapahu and Oahu. And my great grandmother is Hawaiian. My great grandfather is Filipino, and have had generations living on the island. When I was little, I didn't know much that I didn't realize, I didn't recognize, I didn't connect to the seeds that my grandfather would plant into my spirit when it came to culture as medicine. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Some of the things that he would do, he had this pigeon talk, and I didn't know it was pigeon because I was in California, I was in San Francisco, and everyone talked like him that was in my family. So I didn't realize that, all these different pieces of identity and the complexity of identity and where that came from and the impact of trying to hold on to language. And so my grandfather would, tell me many stories of, and he would say Hawaii, and I've always said Hawaii. So, forgive me for any of our elders that might be in this space. I do not speak Hawaiian. I can say a few words. And I know that I have I'm actually wearing a lei right now, my grandfather's lei, but he's no longer with us. But I'm also wearing this one. And this one was made by one of the mothers that is a friend of mine. And her daughters are Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian, and lost her life to being one of our missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so there's quite a story behind that. And I talk a lot more about the work that we do at HIR Wellness. It's integrated. It looks at Indigenous and intergenerational healing. And it brings all of our stories together. And so my grandfather, he would always tell me that aloha, and you learn all these things, like, are these teachings, whether or not they're the same teachings that everybody else gets, they were my teachings, right? And it's amazing how those things protect you on your journey when you have a story of hurt and trauma. And so he would tell me that Lea, aloha isn't just hello or goodbye. He's like, that's not just what it means. He would say alo is living and ha is breath. And he said, it's as I breathe into you, you breathe into me. And it is that exchange that you give to others that is aloha. It's like the way that you exchange your mana. And I had a childhood where there was a lot of relocating, a lot of moving around, a lot of violence, a lot of trauma. And my grandfather, he wasn't able to always protect, and my grandmother weren't able to protect myself and my brother from the experiences that we had. And so he would take me to the water. He went to the water almost every day. And he would sit there, and one time he took me to the water and he said, Lea, I know that you move a lot and you go back between here and Wisconsin. And I know they have a big water out there. And he's like, they have those big lakes. And I said, yeah. And he said to me, I want you to know that no matter where you are, if you find the water, you'll find your relatives, you'll find home. And so no matter where you are, find the water. If you find her, you'll find the connection to your people. He's like, because we're connected by water, not land. And so my grandfather would tell me all these pieces, and I bring that in because those stories actually protected my spirit in some pretty hard times, as a child, and then as an adolescent, and then growing into my young adult years. And it wouldn't be until I was in my mid-20s that I started to remember all of his stories, that I started to connect to the little doses, if you will, of medicine that he would give me. And so when I think about the importance of Dr. Perry's book and our stories and our family stories, I think about not just what happened to you, but what happened to our people, what happened to our communities. I want to first start off with where I'm at right now. I am on the Forest County Potawatomi tribal land in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it is part of just about everybody on my team identifies as Indigenous. Joe is Ho-Chunk from the Ho-Chunk Nation, and it's important to us to be able to recognize our space and place and the land that we belong to. And so we acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland, along with the southwest shores of Minagami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, the Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of the Wisconsin sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. You have both myself and Joe here with you today. Joe is going to support me through my tech stuff, but what I want to share a little bit about is the story of HIR Wellness. When I opened up HIR Wellness, it stands for Healing Intergenerational Roots. And where that comes from is I ended up doing a master's thesis project looking at historical trauma. You're going to see a glimpse of that today. And I wanted to understand adverse childhood experiences and the complexity that I saw in our Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. And I noticed that there was a similarity of pain, of intergenerational trauma that existed. And so I wanted to better understand it. And that research would end up being my life's work. I ended up speaking to over 200 Native people here in Wisconsin. And in those connections that I made, I met an elder, and that elder was a Menominee elder, and he took my survey. I mean, I was pretty impressed that he took it because it was over 70 questions. You know, looking back, that's a lot of itemized questions in that. And he came up to me. And I didn't ask easy questions. I asked about historical trauma as intergenerational trauma. I asked about adverse childhood experiences. I asked about health. I asked about coping. And he came up to me and he said, very quiet, his whole presence came up to me and he said, thank you. And I said, I was a little nervous, right? It was one of our elders. I said, for what, sir? What is it? And he said, for doing something with this. And I remember at that moment, it felt like it was probably only a minute of an exchange, and it felt like 20 minutes. The energy that he came with and the way in which he shared that intention with me, it let me know that I was supposed to do something with this information. I would go on to write this research up and look into it. And what I found was so compelling that I knew that I've been in the mental health field for over 20 years. And I knew that I had to do something with this research to be able to do something different with our mental health practices. And so I opened up HIR Wellness, a nonprofit organization that provides free mental health and wellness and advocacy services to our Indigenous community members in the state of Wisconsin. I developed a shared leadership model, which is matriarchal. And when I say matriarchal, it doesn't just mean women. It means changing the hierarchy to a heterarchy. It means shifting the power differential so that it's not just one voice that gets centered, but that all voices are gathered. This wasn't an easy task to take on because we've been pretty programmed to be in organizations that are that navigate through a linear patriarchal process. And so trying to decolonize that was an interesting process, but we are doing it, and we're doing it really well. And I'm proud to say that I'm seeing a lot of organizational resiliency from it. And we take into consideration of 7 generations before us and thereafter, meaning that when it comes to decision making, when it comes to what we do for our community, the services that we provide, the programming that we want to offer, we're going to the community and we're looking for their feedback, their insight through surveys, through focus groups, through kind of connecting with them and looking at what it is that is on their minds and what they would like to see as part of their healing and what services they feel they need. And so we always are thinking of the past, the present, and the future, informing one another. The community that we serve, again, is our urban Indigenous community, and over 20 tribes are represented in those, including Hawaiians. A little bit of our numbers in action, just so you can kind of get an idea of what it looks like at the organization that I'm growing. Is because of COVID, we saw an increase of 183% direct service support, 87%. Now this number is higher, have identified as female. Over 95% have identified as Indigenous and people of color. And over 67% domestic violence, 72% sexual assault, and 15% human trafficking. When we look at our Native women across Turtle Island in Alaska and Hawaii, what we're seeing is that over 84% have experienced violence in their lifetime, over 56% sexual violence, over 55% physical intimate partner violence, over 48% stalking, 96% violence at the hands of non-Native perpetrators. And I really want to sit with that one for a moment. It's a big impact that colonization has had on our people. The murder rate of Native Indigenous women is more than 10 times than the national average on some reservations. And murder is the 3rd leading cause of death. And suicide is the leading cause of death between the ages of 10 to 24 years old. So I developed programming that would be able to reach our relatives with mental health without borders, being able to provide resources to our schools, to our organizations that are supporting our families, and to create mental health pop-ups and resources that bring providers to the people. Now, there's not a penny that crosses our exchange for our services, and not one insurance card is accepted. And that's because I write grants and do trainings so that we can ensure that it shouldn't cost you to heal. Our direct services over in the last year, we've served over 500 relatives. I do not use the word clients or patients because we are in relationship with one another. We have provided over 6,396 direct connections, and the most recent number that I have is we have surpassed 10,000 connections. And that connections is meaning sessions, means the consultations and sessions that we do to provide services to victims of crime who've experienced sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and it is intergenerational. So we are serving children, youth, adults, and our elders. In fact, we have an elders group, an Indigenous elders group book club, and they will be reading Dr. Perry's book this fall. And they go through different books to help to navigate through healing and sharing their stories, because it's within our stories that we heal. It's within our sharing of our stories in which we heal. And so this group that we have, it's 5 years running now, that I started at a small Oneida office that's here in Milwaukee, and gathered up some elders. And I was intimidated to go in there and begin to say, hey, I think our elders need some mental health services. And everybody was giving them bingo. And I said, I don't know if they're going to go for mental health counseling. And I said, well, why don't we disguise it and let's start sharing stories and be in circle together. Now, today, we're talking about residential boarding school survivors who are sharing their stories for the first time in maybe 60 years. Our healing is deep and it impacts our family. A little bit about mental health, and I like to anchor all of us to this because we're going to be talking about Dr. Perry's book. And Dr. Perry is an incredible person. I had the privilege of meeting him in 2010, and he was so humble. And at that point, I knew of his work since 2000. So I don't know how many of you follow his work around complex and developmental trauma and the neurosequential model of therapeutics. But it would be in, I believe it was 2000 and I want to say 15 or 16, I would be recognized and provided as supported as an inaugural recipient of his Anna Grace Scholarship. And I want to just bring Anna Grace's memory here in this circle today with all of you. Anna Grace was about 6 years old, and she was at the Sandy Hook Elementary and lost her life in that mass shooting. Her parents have now started the Anna Grace organization that continue to remember her and her legacy and talk about trauma in our schools. Dr. Perry helped her family and many more families, as he has in many ways across the globe. And often he does this without anyone knowing that he's supporting or helping these families. It's only because they tend to want to share that they had received his support that people find out. He's a brilliant person, truly is. But I think what I find even more amazing about who he is his humility to walk amongst our communities in the way that he does. He understands that as, and if you hear him talk, he'll say this himself, that as a Euro-American white male, there's only so much he can do to talk about what mental health needs to look like in our communities of color. And so he often shares his platform in spaces and places that will elevate those voices. And so his book that many of you might have with you today, or you will be getting, or you've started reading, and I encourage you to get the Audible because you get to hear Oprah and his voice, and it's pretty engaging, and you get to hear it on a different level, right? But it's a pretty phenomenal book that will get you going and make you think about not just those who you're serving, but about your own story. But so I wanted, before I get into those pieces, it's kind of leading us up to, though, what is mental health and where did it start? Where did it where did it come from when it comes to the way that we understand it here in the US. Mental health hygiene started in 1843, and by 1908, we started to see, mental health hygiene book appear. By 1909, Mental Health America started up by Clifford Beer. And then by 1919, we had the internationalization of the National Commission of Mental Hygiene. It wasn't until the 1930s that it started becoming more of a mainstream conversation. And it wasn't until the 1940s that we saw that Mental Health Association was founded in London. And in the 1950s is when the World Health Organization started to look at it. The reason why I bring this, and I find it to be so important, is because if we're talking about mental health and we're wanting to understand its impact on our children, on our families, and in our communities, we must understand the framework in which it has been built on. And that framework that it has been built on is a Euro-American colonized and white supremacy mindset. And so when we're looking at how do we begin to look at what mental health needs to look like as a practice, as a pedagogy, as a process in our communities, we must understand where it started from, its origins, so that we can reclaim what works for us and know what doesn't. So it wasn't until about the 50s or 60s that actual therapy, right, was something that people were starting to access. And by the time we got to the 80s, even child therapy was just on its kind of start. And so we haven't been working with children in therapy for very long. We treated them like adults in many ways. And we didn't think that if anything happened to you before the age of 10, it was kind of like, well, if you didn't remember it, it didn't happen. And that's not true. What we know now is that your interuterine experience when you were in the belly, your perinatal experience when you are in your first few months of life, your early childhood experiences, those shape your story. And often because those traumas, those experiences are before we are verbal, and if they are before we are verbal and have words to describe, they end up getting installed in our body as a memory. And we are not going to get too deep into the vagus nerve and understanding our social engagement nerve and the impact of the central nervous system and the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. But over 80% of signaling and messaging comes through our central nervous system. And it gets installed and kind of sometimes, if it's not discharged, stuck, encapsulated. And this is important to remember because often if we don't have words to express what we experienced, we will get stuck in a state of either fear or alarm or hypervigilance. And when we are in those spaces of stuckness, and if we are not aware of how to release and discharge that trauma, it will come out in what looks like behavioral issues, what feels like something where someone's being disrespectful in a classroom. And that's not what's happening. Understanding the story of the body, understanding the story of the hurt. And that's really hard to do in a classroom because you already have a lot to do, things that you have to get done in order for the students that you are supporting and serving to learn the curriculum that is needing to be taught. Yet our children are coming in with those stories, and not just their stories, but their family stories and their ancestors' stories. And so some of you, I'm thinking at this point, have heard of adverse childhood experiences, and Dr. Perry is going to talk about that in this book. And so I want to give you a little bit of context on how I like to talk about the adverse childhood experiences. The adverse childhood experiences was done with Anda and Folletti in 1997, and it was part of a Kaiser Permanente study with the CDC. And what they were looking at was the impact of obesity in our communities, specifically those in California, and more specifically, they were predominantly white upper middle class patients that they were working with. And what they found out through their research, and this was 2 different labs, and if you learn all about it, it's over a 20-year-old study, right? But what they learned through happenstance, truly, is that certain things were starting to fall out, and certain things on their questionnaire, it's like if you had these certain questions, they were connecting a lot to trauma, and that trauma, those who were trying to lose the weight in their obesity studies were also losing the weight but gaining it back really quickly. And they noticed that that specific group had a lot of trauma history through their surveys and questionnaires. That ended up developing their 10-item scale that they have with yes and no. And if you've not taken it, I want to encourage you to take it, but also understand that it can only capture so much of your story. But what they found out was that if you had an ACE score of 3 or more, you had the likelihood of health issues, mental health issues, hypertension, diabetes, and early death. And so they started to look into this. And as they did, again, over 20-year-old study at this point, these are the questions that they had. So for those of you who have not yet seen the ACE survey, you can go ahead and Google it, download it. It's free to do. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I do want to highlight some of them. They look at things like, did you ever experience any abuse or just with a level of dysfunction in your home? They look at whether or not your mother experienced different types of violence in front of you. They look at if your family had separation or divorce, if there was mental health or substance use in your home. And when you're done, you get to answer all of these and you add them up, and that is your ACE score. But what we realized as people continue to lean in and learn more about adverse childhood experiences is that it was deeper. There was more to it, right? And there is these other pieces of trauma and social location, looking at the embodiment of historical trauma, the social conditions, and then the complex and developmental trauma that is beneath the adverse childhood experiences. We have things like the pair of ACEs that also recognizes that adverse community events are part of it. And there are limitations and implications for our Black and Indigenous communities when it comes to using the adverse childhood experiences, such as painful questions that get asked. Looking at mental health in our communities, 1 in 4 people will live with mental health throughout the world. 1 in 5 people live in the United States with a mental health concern. But yet in our Native communities, 1 in 2 will have a mental health concern. And so when we're looking at trauma-informed schools, and we're seeing that our communities have higher rates and numbers of substance use and mental health and suicide and homicide, sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, where does that come from? And understanding the deeper levels of where that comes from helps us to be able to begin to have a conversation around community healing. Often our mental health as a system looks at labels and diagnoses, anger and aggression. And underneath that, they say, okay, you're scared, you're feeling frustrated and uncomfortable. The truth is, those are arbitrary definitions of what somebody is going through. Often we are limited in being able to describe somebody else's lived experience. They look like they're angry, but maybe they're in fear. They look like they're frustrated, but maybe they're feeling uncertain and uncomfortable. And so as we continue to look at what our emotions are connected to, we start to go deeper. And we start to look at the unspeakable and unacknowledged, such as attunement and regulation and attachment, justice. We begin to go beyond the individual and we start to look at the collective and what is experienced in our communities. Looking at systems of dominance, social issues, violence, poverty, the patriarchy, racism, colonialism. And at the midnight level, requires deep dives into the collective shadow of our communities and our ancestral stories. Much research has been conducted on the social, economic, and political effects of racism, but little research has recognize the psychological effects of racism of people of color. And we want to look then at transgenerational trauma, which Dr. Perry will talk about in his book. And if you're not familiar, this is the trauma that gets passed on from generation to generation through epigenetics, through vicariously. And so looking at transgenerational trauma and the effects it has in our communities demands that even though we know that the child might be experiencing mental health concerns or unwellness, disconnection and alienation, possibly from their family or kinship, we have to look deeper and understand the things that will help us to be safe and connected to our cultural ways and healing ways. Historical intergenerational trauma can be defined as an event or series of events perpetrated against a group of people and their environment, namely people who share a specific group identity with genocidal or ethicidal intent to systematically eradicate them as a people or eradicate their way of life. Trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualized over time looks like family traits, and trauma in a people decontextualized over time looks like culture. Resmaa Menakem. And if you are not familiar with his book, My Grandmother's Hands, it's a great book to own. Historical unresolved grief. All of these terms, if you've not heard them before, if this is the first time, I'm available. You can email me. We can have a deeper conversation around this. But historical trauma, unresolved grief accompanies historical trauma, and it can be associated with historical trauma responses. These are a constellation of features in reaction to massive group trauma. This response has been observed in Lakota and other Native populations, African American slaves and their descendants, Jewish Holocaust survivors and descendants, Japanese American internment camps, and what has happened to the Hawaiian people as well. The impact of colonization as a trauma that we must heal from. So mourning in our communities has been halted. And yet, right, we're having children and we're parenting and we're doing the best we can, and our caregiver capacity is maxed out. And so in order for us to heal, we must go from the I to the us to the we, healing together in relationships. In order to do that, our relationships must also be working towards wellness. Transgenerational trauma transmission renders some children survivors vulnerable to stress while others become more resilient. Both seems to be remember what their parents and their grandparents might have forgotten. Often these traumas, they're not remembered in the same way as recalling back to the first time you learned how to ride a bike or a dinner that you had with your family. These memories are disenfranchised within our body, within our families, within our community, and they get passed on in different ways. So the pathways of trauma transmission happens through dishonoring, dismantling, disorganizing, and destroying cultural ways, practices, and language. It gets passed on through learning about how to heal through Indigenous scholars. And it also gets passed through health disparities. And so when I think about that middle one, the theories, that's part of our resilience to trauma transmission. Learning, recognizing what our communities need and what will help them heal. Recognizing the impact that our communities have had when it comes to historical trauma. And then research. Suicide is a result of colonization, not a mental illness. Suicide is a fairly natural but terrible response to colonization. Suicide is not a sickness, it is a response to a terrible pain. Through the research that I did and through Indigenous scholars that speak to this work, some of the risk factors: residential boarding schools, loss of cultural identity, loss of traditional ways, loss of language, loss by substance use, and loss of spiritual ways. Exposure to community violence leads to increased risk of PTSD, substance abuse, and suicide. What people often think suicide prevention is and what it really is: food security, connection to our culture and our land, increasing accessibility to mental health services, destigmatizing mental health, housing. We are connected to our ancestors, and what happens to them happens to us. That's both the resilience, which becomes your brilliance, and the things that have wounded them. What has happened to the past impacts our future. Pain will travel through families until somebody is ready to feel it. And so I created this model, and this model looks at historical trauma over time and how it gets passed on to as intergenerational trauma, transgenerational trauma transmission that influences higher rates of adverse childhood experiences, and then leads to further contemporary colonial trauma. And that colonial trauma is our pipeline issues, our water rights, and our water protectors. It's looking at protecting our lands, our sacred spaces. That is our future generations' historical trauma will be our contemporary trauma that is today. And this cycle continues to perpetuate. So what happened, not just to you, but to us, to our communities. And so I created another term. From my research, I wanted to look at, we're taught as clinicians to use the DSM-5, and it's really just a book of symptoms, right? Yet they want to be able to diagnose things like general anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder. What about diagnosing our systems and our environments that are making us sick? What about looking at the environments that are feeding our people and our communities on wellness? So I came up with this term, PTSE, persistent toxic systems and environments. These are everyday environmental, traumatic, or stressful events that negatively impact one's mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical health outcomes. PTSE is repeated and regular exposure to toxic surroundings and systems that are felt, seen, heard, and interpreted by individuals as inescapable barriers or hardships. Colonization dismantled our systems of care and turned what we saw as in circle and in union with each other, and gave everything a ranking order versus it living in harmony. The pieces that I'm sharing right now, looking at historical trauma as intergenerational trauma, understanding transgenerational trauma transmission, leading up to adverse childhood experiences within our communities of color. It's not just understanding the adversity in our families, but why that adversity is there, what happened. And so Dr. Perry, this is from, if you purchase the Audible book, you'll be able to download a PDF of his appendixes that I'm going to be sharing with you all very soon. And it looks at some of his core concepts around what happened to you, looking at the neurobiology of what happened to you, the cultural aspects of, and the community aspects of what has impacted you, looking at the sequential order in which we develop, looking at what resilience really is and what increases our vulnerabilities and or increases our resilience through relational health, through rhythm and regulation. And so we're going to go a little into some of his slides. I know I shared a lot in a very short amount of time around looking at the impact of historical trauma in relationship to Dr. Perry's book. If you need to get a glass of water, if there's anything that's near you that will help you to, if you've been holding your breath or even clenching your jaw, for you to be able to release anything that it is that you are holding on to. Because I do know that I would like to be able to give all of this more time, more energy, so it doesn't feel so rushed. So my apologies for that. So as we look at going into Dr. Perry's book, I just want to point you into some areas to pay attention to as you begin to read his book, learn about Oprah's story and their relationship. They've known each other for a really long time. And Dr. Perry's worked with her in many different ways. And you'll learn about that in the book. And he talks about it as well if you listen to any of his speaking engagements or presentations. But the neurosequential model of therapeutics is NMT, and I'm trained, I'm also a trainer in the model. And it's looking at the neurosequential and neurobiological development of children who have been through a lot of trauma, both intrauterine all the way up through childhood. But I want you to know that this is not a specific therapeutic technique or intervention. It is a developmentally sensitive, neurobiologically informed approach to clinical work, and he has also developed one for education. And I really do urge you to look into the NME of education, because it will allow you to use a lot of the NMT stuff that I'll be talking about today, but it will break it down in a different way that makes sense for schools. He also has NMC, which is for caregivers, and he has NMS for sports. And so it's a beautiful way to be able to bring all of us together in creating universal language around how do we approach a trauma-informed healing space. The key, active participation of caregivers and other adults in the child's life. And so an NMT, I won't be able to get too deep into what an NMT looks like, but it's a evaluation of somebody's story. We look at their relational health, their family's attunement, their primary caregivers' attunement to them or lack thereof. We're looking at the predictability and consistency in their life, and when were things disrupted? And if they were disrupted, were there protective measures in place? After we're done with an NMT, you end up getting what's called a brain map and a metric that explains where that child is developmentally and what pathways might support their healing therapeutically through creating trauma-informed and neurobiologically informed therapeutic interventions. Creating a relational space for optimal development, learning, and healing through presence, being parallel, patient, and persistent in providing patterned, predictable, and positive doses of protected experiences. So the neurobiology of stress, some of you may know of this, but it's okay. Stress and trauma isn't the bad guy in the room, right? We have to start normalizing trauma healing, but also understanding that when we have stress, if it's tolerable or if it's positive stress, we can learn how to make meaning out of it. We can have capacity to learn new information. But if we have chronic stress in our lives, where we are being activated regularly, our state of arousal is high or underactive, and we are disassociative, it leads into toxic stress. And that toxic stress can look everything from experiencing violence in your home to just experiencing a home that has little resources and few caregivers to support. And there is lots of stress and caregiver needs that need to be attended to. A mother who is a single mom in a home who has to do the dishes and clean the house and work 2 jobs and take care of 3 kids, right? And then what we do is we say, hey, mom, why don't you do more? We have these exercises that we want you to do at the house so you can help them to be, to cope differently in school or in the classroom. And what we really need to do is, instead of giving mom something else to do, or dad, or whoever's in that child's life as a primary caregiver, is to support them through extending the caregivership, providing more resources that relieve them from those responsibilities. So stress either creates vulnerability or resilience. And through Dr. Perry's model that you'll be reading about and learning about, unpredictable, severe, and prolonged equals vulnerability, but predictable, moderate, and controlled stress equals resilience. See, if we're in school and we are under a stress level that creates vulnerability, our ability to access our prefrontal cortex, that reasoning part of our brain, the executive functioning, the ability to write an essay or write my name on the paper or just be able to listen to a lesson, well, that ability decreases. And so what you'll see is that when we have we're going to talk about state-based dependency, but our brains are state-based, which means that if my environment is informing me that there is something to be stressed about, that there is something to be overwhelmed about, that there is fear or angst in my environment, I'm going to orient to that. And the longer I'm there, the less capacity I have to access the higher domains within my brain to be able to learn and absorb information. So every time I get activated, every time I have a response to something that is happening in my environment, whether it's a sound or a voice that is bringing me back into dysregulation, are moments that I'm losing to be able to be present, attuned, and able to stay focused to learn. So typical development, if we've had okay parenting and, you know, some stress or trauma has happened, but we've always had somebody or resources or ways to navigate, we're able to develop in a sequential way, which means that we have more time that we're spending in our cognitive and social and emotional parts of our brain. What we're looking at from the bottom up in that survival part on the typical development, that's the brainstem. Regulation is the dicephalon, the limbic system is our social and emotional, and our prefrontal cortex is the cognitive. On the right side is when we have experienced long-term trauma in our families, in our life. That means that my ability to access my prefrontal cortex, where I can think, learn, remember things. And you ever have a kid where you just told them something and you can't remember what you just told them, and you're thinking, well, what? We just talked about that, and we talked about it yesterday. When we're under stress, the way that we remember things changes. Our ability to hold information changes. And we jump back down to our survival mechanisms in our brain, meaning that our body is working really hard. That parasympathetic nervous system's working really hard to make sure that we can respond to whatever we're perceiving as the threat. And so in your book, you're going to have these beautiful images that Dr. Perry and his team has developed. The impact of developmental experiences, the balance between adversity and connectedness. See, Dr. Perry's work and the work that I do as well leans into understanding our relational health and well-being. It's not that we experience trauma. It's that in what context did we experience that trauma, and who did we have within our life at that time to help support us through it. And so when we're looking at this diagram here, the more adversity and the less amount of relational health that you have increases your vulnerability. But the higher level of relational health with adversity decreases your vulnerability to it, your susceptibility to it. With high connectedness and low adversity during development, the balance of developmental risk is tipped in the direction of lower risk for mental, social, and physical health problems. In contrast, high adversity and minimal connectedness increases developmental risk and the probability of significant problems in overall health. He talks about emotional contagion. What I'm feeling and how I'm feeling will impact you, and you will impact me. That frequency, that vibration, that mana that we share, it can take us into different spaces. We have decision fatigue and moral injury that happens when we have had prolonged trauma in our communities, and we have it in our families, and we have it also in our systems in which we navigate. Patterns of stress and looking at it from a perspective of sense of time diminishes when we are in stress. Our adrenaline pumps through our bodies and potentially increases that activation of flee, fight, immobilize. Understanding our ability to be sensitized or desensitized to stress isn't just something that we look at adults, we're looking at it in our children as well. Looking at a kid that might have an over-sensitized system is one that might not be responding to extreme sounds or noises in that environment. They seem like they're not responsive all the time to maybe something that they should be responsive to when it comes to orienting themselves to alert or alarm. And a desensitized system, well, that's a desensitized system. And a sensitized system is one that is overreacting to something that is, the books fall on the desk, right? From the desk, and they fall down, they make a loud noise, and they jump. Many of us might orient, but it distracts that child from being able to come back into focus. And then all of a sudden you start seeing that they're fidgeting and then they're moving around and they're just not listening anymore. And they get distracted very easily, being sensitized to all the movements and the sounds in their environment. Understanding our stress response systems help us to better understand our state. If we can understand our state, we can understand how to navigate in a way that promotes wellness for our bodies, for our minds, our hearts, and our spirit. So Dr. Perry has this image too that you're going to see in the book, and it's a model of the brain. And again, this is where we're at, right? If we're stressed out, if we're feeling this, you know this yourself, your heart rate starts to beat faster, you're holding your breath, you're clenching your jaw, your temperature changes, you're hot, you're colder. All these things are happening. And these are signals to us to let us know that we're feeling some sort of way, that we're having a stress response happen right now. And that could be a good thing. Stress isn't bad. But remember, if it's being activated regularly, chronically, over time, it becomes toxic. We start to notice that we're snacking a lot when we're stressed out, or we got to move a lot, and we're pacing and we're going around and we're trying to figure out, those are our body's natural mechanisms to try and regulate itself, to try and bring us back into a homeostasis. And then our limbic system, we start to notice that our memory is kind of foggy. We can't recall something that we know, looking to seek for more immediate gratification versus delayed gratification. Looking at our emotions and our moods. And then our ability to think creatively, to be innovative, to be courageous in our vulnerability, to have hope, to be curious of our environment. When we are stressed, we're suspicious of our environment. When we feel safe and supported, we are curious about our environment. Those are two totally different things. Is the child in your room suspicious or curious? These are all indicators to understanding what is needed to help provide a trauma-informed space, not just for that child, not just for you, but for everybody in that classroom. There's different states of regulation. And again, I brought up a little bit about the automatic nervous system, looking at the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, our senses, our interoception, which is that felt sense inside. All of these pieces are the pieces that we aren't often taught about in child development early on, right? We're taught about attachment styles. I myself, with my undergrad in psychology, learned a lot about attachment styles. But where does that come from? Understanding the neurobiology of our core regulatory networks and our neural system is part of being trauma informed. Looking at certain behaviors, certain actions, certain ways of being are reflective of where we are physiologically. So the patterns of stress activation, remember, we saw this earlier, unpredictable, extreme, and prolonged equals sensitization or vulnerability. Patterns of stress that are predictable, moderate, controllable equal tolerance, which is resilience. Long-term effects of stress are determined by the pattern of stress activation. When the stress response systems are activated in unpredictable or extreme or prolonged ways, the system becomes overactive and overly reactive, not responsive. In other words, sensitized. Over time, this can lead to functional vulnerability. And since the stress response systems collectively reach all parts of the brain and body, a cascade of risk in emotional, social, mental, and physical health occurs. In contrast, predictable, moderate, and controllable activation of the stress response systems, such as that seen in developmentally appropriate challenges in education, sports, music, and so forth, can lead to a stronger, more flexible stress response system and increases your capability. So when I mentioned earlier state-based functioning or state-dependent functioning, what we're looking at is if we are living most days in a state of alarm, fear, or terror, our ability to be responsive and reflective decreases. In fact, our functional IQ can drop 10 to 20 more or even more points based on being in alarm, fear, or terror. Our ability to be innovative or creative or to recall within our memory system decreases. Our sense of time diminishes. Our ability to do the task at hand becomes more difficult. And so all of us are on this state-dependent functioning all the time, right? But if I wake up alert in the morning because I have someone yelling in my house and I woke up late and I didn't finish my homework and I have stress going on in my family, people were up late arguing and fighting, I'm experiencing violence, and then all of a sudden, I'm in alert and I all of a sudden get late to school and I'm in trouble now. And now I got to talk to somebody about because I'm late or I didn't finish my assignment. Now I'm in alarm. And now let's just say that my relationship with my teacher isn't that great. And I start to hear their voice and their disapproval or their disappointment in me. That can activate us into a deeper part of alarm or into fear. And what is happening, our connections, our relationships throughout the day are either informing us that we are safe or not safe. That is what they're doing. And that image that I shared before where it had survival more in the bottom, if I am in that space where I'm trying to figure out, am I safe here? Am I okay? Are things going to be okay? If I have to be there, my ability to do lessons in school drastically decrease. My ability to recall or remember anything that you're teaching drastically decreases. My ability to retain information for any amount of time. The key is being able to regulate, relate, and reason. Being able to look at the function of our state in which we're feeling, our angst or our worry, and how to then regulate our system, relate to what our needs are, and then we will be able to access the higher cortical modulation of our reasoning, our executive functioning. There's mechanisms of transgenerational trauma. I brought up that very briefly earlier on, and we're looking at genetics and epigenetics and intrauterine experiences and postnatal and perinatal, right? All of these pieces of this is what we're looking at when we're doing an NMT. I provide these for free to our Indigenous community members, and I'll even do them on elders. Anybody that wants to be able to learn more about their story and what will help to support the healing of their brain. Because if your neurobiology has been developed in a way that was protecting you to develop in a sense of response to threat and fear, we can heal that. It takes time, but we can heal that. And we can heal your brain. You can heal your brain. But we must understand all the components, not just look at somebody and say, oh, that's a behavioral chart. And oh, okay, they're not acting right. And that's oppositional defiant. That's ADHD. That's fill in the blank. Often what you're seeing is an overstressed or sensitized stress response system. And you see symptoms of that and symptoms of trauma. And so instead of us rushing to the diagnostics of that, understanding the healing components of it, to regulate, relate, and reason. You'll be learning a lot about that in Dr. Perry's book. Our brains are continuously getting input from our body, interoception. And the world, 5 senses, really there's more than 5 senses. We have, in addition to your 5 senses, we have proprioception, interoception, and I work with occupational therapists that I think can add another 3 more of those senses to the list. And we need to be able to reason. In order for us to be able to reason, to sit with somebody, to understand that we did something that maybe wasn't kind, or we need to be able to connect to a lesson. To be able to reason with another person, we need to effectively get through the lower areas of the brain and to reach their cortex. The part responsible for thinking, including problem solving and reflective cognition. Even when we think of like cognitive behavioral therapy, which was based on behavioralism, which is rooted in a white supremacy mindset framework, is missing huge components of what somebody is really going through. When we look at cognitive behavioral therapies, they are addressing our prefrontal cortex and our limbic systems. In order to do the assignments, the interventions, those are the parts of the brain that need to be online. When we look at evidence-based practice, where we are recognizing and realizing through the research that CBT is not a sustainable evidence-based practice. It has a peak experience. There's a reason for that. It's because we must understand the neurobiology of our stress that leads to all of the symptoms that we're observing. State reactive curve, you're also going to see this in his book. Again, if I can have a daily challenge, stress is not bad, trauma is not bad. Trauma and stress happens in our lives. We will experience things that are unfair. We'll experience violence in our life. And we experience daily stress. Just car isn't working. You're kicked out of your place. You don't have enough money for your rent. So these daily challenges and moderate stress, if we continue to be activated in alarm, fear, and terror, and we stay there for extended amounts of time, that is going to create distress, and we follow it over to being sensitized. And if we are sensitized, we are reactive to our stress constantly, which keeps us into those lower regions of our brain, that part where we're in that survival mechanism, right? Where we're suspicious of things versus curious of things. When a challenge or stressor occurs, it will push us out of balance, and an internal stress response will be activated to get us back in balance. With no significant stressors, no internal needs unmet, and no external complexity or threat, will be in a state of calm. As challenges and stress increase, our internal state will shift from alert to terror. It's important to understand these pieces because we can see it playing out in front of us. Recognizing, is someone holding their breath? Are they clenching their jaw? How are they holding their body? How are they reacting to sounds? State dependency and memory is huge. And if you're going to be a trauma-informed school, understanding in a school system, understanding our impact of stress on our memory. And it is, again, when I am dysregulated, my ability to access my cortex is limited. My ability to access and have any modulation or control over my emotions is limited. What you're going to see increase is my movement or my lack of movement, which might be on that continuum of disassociation. What you might see is physiological responses in my body. And when you see that, my ability to access my cortical memories are limited. When I am regulated, I can access my memories in a much more clear and thoughtful way. State-dependent access to narrative memory. In a fear state, dysregulated, there is a shutdown of some of the systems in higher areas of our brain. This makes retrieval of previous linear narrative memory insufficient. A common example of this is a test anxiety, where we just freeze up. The content has been stored, but the moment to be able to retrieve it is not possible. When the person is regulated and feeling connected and safe, the stored content is accessible and easier to retrieve. But yet, if I am chronically stressed, my ability to even create memory is challenged. So Dr. Perry also has this in his in the downloaded notes that I would have sent out to Candice to share with everybody for his notes. You know what I'm saying. Anyways, this is actually was created by some First Nations people that are in Alberta. He does a lot of his work in Alberta, Dr. Perry does, and holds his neurosequential model of therapeutics symposium there as well. And I've had the opportunity to present there just about every year that he has held it. And when we look at, and this is also a member of the Blackfoot Nation, why he shares this is Dr. Perry says, and this is from his book, if we truly want to understand ourselves, we need to understand our history, our true story, because the emotional residue of our past follows us. But that can happen until there is a tipping point of awareness. Understanding your society and historical context of the experiences that your families have experienced, what they have witnessed, what they have gone through, is critically important to understanding what happened, not just the individual, but to our group. It was through Dr. Perry's work that I looked at this and said, you know what, interesting enough from my teachings that I have, it's not just people that dysregulate or regulate us. it's our environment that is healing, but also that we can respond to great loss, understanding our relationship with what Western Euro-American language would say is inanimate relatives. For me, I see them as my relatives. Our first relationship was with water in the belly. Our first ability to be connected to those plant relatives, the water relatives, the land, it informs us. That is also part of our regulation. Sometimes there's not a person that can bring that to you. There's not a object that can do that for you. But being with our land, being with the water, being with our ways, they're living. So understanding that from Indigenous practices, our attachment to what they consider to be inanimate also needs to hold space and place in our Indigenous communities in the conversation of mental health. In order for us to have healthy storytelling and sharing, healthy culture sharing, there are things in our environment that can help us to regulate, relate, to reason. So on the right-hand side is the model that I developed in relationship to Dr. Perry's regulatory networks one. So what is resiliency? What is community resiliency? It was Albert Einstein who said, the future of medicine will be the medicine of frequencies of energy. And it was Audre Lorde who said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. Now, we've talked a little bit about what resiliency is from a neurobiological perspective, but I also want to talk about it from the way in which we use it in our schools. Often, resiliency from the colonial mindset is pull yourself up from your bootstraps and, get on with it and, dust yourself off. Well, we understand that resiliency is so much more than that. What it isn't is it is never a reason or an excuse to permit harm or oppression or to ignore the harm and oppression many communities, children and youth and poor and working class people face as they are so resilient. This sadly is thrown around too often by people who have systemic privilege. It becomes a way for privileged people to minimize or rationalize their own privilege, manage their helplessness, or excuse their own inaction. Resiliency is a tool for healing and creating just, loving, and sustainable conditions, not one to rationalize violence or oppression. Resilience is being tested, researched, and used to make traumatizing and unjust situations and conditions more tolerable or acceptable. And there are folks like myself who recoil from the word resilience. It can be a sensitive subject, both painful and polarizing. Many of us see resilience as a possible antidote to the avalanche of adversity in the world. However, many trauma survivors with the experience that are often minimized, marginalized, and medicalized are often frustrated by what seems like excessive funding for the fascination with resilience. Communities are held hostage to expect research from the West and to models of development that negate local and Indigenous knowledge. In fact, the American Psychological Association, the APA, estimates that the cost of treating and supporting mental health illness is approximately $55 billion a year. But when we add in the impact of productivity, accidents, social welfare programs, we are at over $273 billion a year. So my question is, can you heal everything that I'm talking about in 96 hours or 2.5 weeks? No, right? That's 2 years of therapy. That's 2 years of individual therapy, 1 hour a week, if you get an hour, if it's not 50 minutes, and if you make it all the time. If you were to go to therapy for 48 weeks, I'm going to give you some credit and say you're not going to go for certain holidays and you won't make all of them. So let's say 48 weeks. That's 48 hours in a year. That's 96 hours in 2. That's 2.5 weeks of 40-hour weeks. The level of healing that our communities need goes so much deeper than talk therapy. And I am a clinical therapist. I believe in therapy with all of my heart. I believe that it can help. I believe it can make incredible strides in people's life, but it only touches on part of the medicine that's needed to support our communities. The barriers to care that our people are facing, it's bottlenecking of services, high cost to being able to even access a mental health provider, and limited access to providers. And then let's say providers that are culturally responsive and understand liberation psychology or social justice. And then the hours of availability do not line up often with our relatives' work hours, making it even more difficult to access care. And then let's throw in all of the deaths and loss from the pandemic. I share all of this because there's hope. There is so much hope, and there is the possibility to be able to start to create new. It's time to decolonize our mental health, and this is what I talk a lot about, but we need to do it together, all of our nations. Cultural competency, not a word I'm really a big fan of, because I can't even be competent in my own culture. Nobody can. We're all learning. We're all learning. And you know how much shame is out there when we're afraid to talk about how we identify because we don't know enough of our community, our languages, our cultures, our traditions. I see it all the time here in Wisconsin with the tribes, with the survivors and the relatives that we work with and their identity within their tribes. See, cultural humility is the term I recommend. Shifting the language to being humble, to learning more and to learning about others in a respectful and humble way, in a good way. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist, Angela Davis. So I developed a new network that I provide here at my organization. It's called a Wellness Village. And what it looks like is it's taking community mental health, advocacy, and clinical care into consideration. And any of our relatives that come here and are seeking out our services are given a circle of care. And that circle of care means that they are given our community healers, our therapists, our advocates, our OTs, our occupational therapy providers, to address the healing that is needed in not just their life, but maybe in their families or within their environment. And so when our relatives come to us, we understand not only do I train and teach about Dr. Perry's work, which I really only just touched the surface of his work, had to push through it pretty quickly, but I do want you to understand that his work is incredible and we can use it within our Indigenous communities. But I also believe, like any other teaching or training that's out there, if used in a certain mindset or framework, can be used in a way that wouldn't help our communities. So we need to be able to reclaim the knowledge that works for us. And then it needs to be led. The efforts need to be led by people in our community. What teachings, what knowledge we know will help to feed and support and protect our communities. So we look at family and kinship, cultural practices, advocacy, something that I developed called community activated medicine, wellness groups. And we bring our relatives together in what Elder Koyas calls, who created white bison, who developed white bison. If you're not familiar with his work, Elder Koyas, he calls it the healing forest. And he looks at it and says, you know, people will look at our leaves of our trees. If you had a forest of our community members and you look at the leaves of the trees and the bark of the tree and you say, oh, that tree's sick, cut it down. He says, no, you don't cut that down. Look at the soil. Look at what has poisoned the soil, that has fed the trees and poisoned the leaves. Understanding the system, the roots, and not just treating the observations that we see. So Dr. Perry's work looks at therapeutic webs. such as relational webs and dosings. And I have created, he does this for individuals and families, and I have developed it so that we can do it for our community. So I create community therapeutic webs with my team. And so we look at relational webs as the collection of safe, supported, and consistent relationships in one's life. They can be robust, and they can help to support a buffer against adversity. Or they can be non-existent or depleted and make one more vulnerability to adversity. Dosing is the amount that we're doing something. How often are we providing that support, that relationship, that connection? What's the spacing between it? How much time is between when I am providing that? And the therapeutic web is all the different things that are happening in somebody's daily, in their day, in their week, in their month, that allow them to have positive experiences with supportive relationships and resources and culture in their life. This picture was taken at a powwow by one of my now staff. Was an intern, now staff. And this picture is of a grandmother, a granddaughter, and the mother. I developed the intergenerational healing approach. And it looks at, we need to heal through mentorship and modeling and intergenerationally. That means we bring all of our relatives together, all of the ages. We have a Daughters of Tradition group, we have an elders group, we have so many different groups where we bring all ages together to be able to learn. Our children need to learn from our elders, and our elders need to be with our children. That is how our culture and our stories and our languages are passed on generation to generation. I have a term called triple attunement that I teach here at my institute, and that's understanding that in therapy we have something called dual attunement. And dual attunement means I understand what's going on with me, and I can see what's going on with you, and I'm attuning to your needs, and I'm recognizing any kind of response that I might be having and learning how to balance that out or respond to it. Triple attunement is that our environment informs our safety. It's checking around to see what I call warming up the space, which is how are we making our environment, a classroom, a therapy room, how are we making it feel supported? And there's a lot of ways that we can make the space feel supported. The space is living. It has energy. The furniture has energy. How are we cleansing the energy when we are with our relatives that are discharging their responses of their traumas, or a classroom that is discharging their response to their traumas? How do we attune to the space and the environment? Triple attunement is a way of connecting to what's around us, not just to the people, but to the lighting, the smells, and are we recognizing what can be activating and what can be regulating? Community activated medicine means that the people are the medicine, and it is a process of informing to activate the healing within and around us. So I train and I teach students. I have a training clinic, and I take students from all over who are in their master's programs, learning how to be social workers, counselors, occupational therapists. And we talk about what it means to bring yourself into space, how to be supportive, and how to do community mental health work. We have different terms. I won't have time to get into children's fire or circle of care, but these things are really important to understanding decision-making within our communities and teaching our children how to have decision-making and leadership and governance skills that go in a circle of care using a matriarchal approach. It's understanding our needs, and also, as you might know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which he took and relabeled for himself from the Blackfoot Nation. And in his process of filtering it through his own lens, his own Western lens, he took a big piece out that was pretty important about self-actualization. And that is, from the First Nations perspective, self-actualization was just that's just getting you ready. That was just getting you ready. That's just getting you ready for community actualization and the cultural perpetuity of your community. We need to learn about our medicines from our communities, our teachings, how to grow our medicines, practice them, and then how to give them to others, because reciprocity is part of our community healing. Identifying our medicine kits, I go through this in a workshop, but I just wanted to share with you briefly that it includes things like social justice and radical joy and understanding our relationship to our plant relatives and our water relatives and our spiritual and our faith and our community. There's so many aspects of, we think of self-care, and I want you to know that self-care has been commodified. It has been incredibly colonized. Self-care is understanding your yeses are yeses and your noes are noes. It's taking care of your boundaries, understanding your abilities, letting yourself feel not okay when you're not okay, being honest and walking in your truth. Self-care is an act of radical healing. Body and breath practices help us with that self-care. These activate your vagus nerve and your central nervous system and your brainstem. So things like, if you see a kid in a class humming, let that child hum. And if it's distracting others, find a way for them to be able to do what they need to, because they are regulating their brain. If they are rocking, they're regulating their body so that they can be in that space with you. There's so much that we could get into. Chanting is regulating your body. All of these things that we know to be true in our communities and our cultures, taught from our kupuna, these are things that we've had, but we've been told, or they've been minimized or diminished in the mental health world, saying they're not evidence-based. Well, I do practice-based evidence for practice-based medicine. And that means that I look to things that have worked in our communities for generations, have been taught by our ancestors, and what is still working today. And we bring that in to the work that we do. It's identifying your guardians and looking at how to create a circle of care. This is where I teach about children's fire. I just want to bring that to you because it's really important with schools. There's 2 laws to children's fire, and that is the feminine and children must be protected at all costs. And 2, the fire must never go out. And that last one is really important, because what that means, I don't know what it looks like over in your spaces, but I can say that here in Milwaukee, the fires that get lit when somebody has passed and waiting for them to cross over. When you have a fire, it's not just a fire keeper that is there holding that fire. It's all of the people making sure that that fire stays lit. It's the people bringing the wood to that person who's the fire keeper. It's a person that's bringing them water, someone who's making food in the kitchen, who's making sure that they can stay there to tend to that fire. It's the person that takes turns and says, hey, time for you to take a nap so I can keep that fire going. See, the symbolism behind fire keeping and to keep a fire going wouldn't be sustainable with just 1 or 2 people. Everyone must take their part in keeping that fire going. That is our community. That is wellness. Understanding our roles and responsibilities that have been taken from us. Our roles and responsibilities. Our children must know their roles and responsibilities to their community. My team talks about children's fire here, and I'm just going to read one of them to you. The children's fire is an ancient decision-making model that encourages participants to see from other perspectives. It embodies inclusion in this democratic process in the best ways. Leadership, critical thought, empathy, compassion, and responsibility are encouraged at all levels. It's shared leadership and constantly asking the question, have we thought of everything? Which is critical for our survival. It's embodying the 8th generation, which has been said by our elders that the light of the 8th generation represents the choice that lays ahead if they choose the right road. Then the 7th fire will light the 8th and final fire, the eternal fire of peace, love, siblinghood, sisterhood, and brotherhood. Our Indigenous girls group, I bring Dr. Perry's work. Everything that I'm sharing with you right now is connected to his work because I have been informed by his teachings, and I've learned how to integrate those into working with our Indigenous kids, our families, our elders. You ask anybody on my team, they're going to tell you, yep, Lea has probably thought about how to regulate, relate, reason on every single thing that she does. And I do, using therapeutic webs, which is his work as well. learning how to take what he shares and what he teaches from the work that he has over a lifetime and how to integrate that in our Indigenous communities to serve our relatives. It's helping, it's working. Our girls, when they are together, I have an intergenerational girls group. There's 25 of them. And they're all ages, from little sisters to big sisters to mentors to ambassadors. It's a modeling group, mentorship group. And I asked them what they wanted to do. And when they did this art project, they were invited to be part of an art gallery. And they were told, they said to me, we want to talk about our communities and how to take care of our communities. And our girls learn about these teachings so that they can share them within their families, within their next generation. We do circles of care and campsites, which are community activated medicine places where just last night we had one where we went to a Native school and we set up shop. We had a booth and we bring providers into the school and we're there to connect, to relate. And we had a family that came up to us who really needed some support and had experienced some pretty extreme violence recently, and they needed a way to get resources. And if we weren't in the community, if we were sitting in our offices waiting for people to come to us, our communities need a different type of service for mental health. That's what I'm saying. We do wellness consults. All of these pictures are from different spaces and places pre-COVID that we do. I have programming where I have events for over 300, 500 people that show up from our community. Creating community healing. Communication is all about rupture and repair, disconnection plus connection. It is essential to explicitly acknowledging our differences, assumptions, implicit biases to build relationships, Dr. Perry. This is part of one of our circles that we do at the Oneida office here in Milwaukee. What works best in anything that increases the quality or number or relationships in a child's life? People, not programs, change people. And this is one of our groups again with all of our families. And what our girls are doing is they learn healing techniques and practices and self-care and self-compassion and sisterhood. And then they demonstrate that after their sessions are done. They have 12 sessions in a season, and they demonstrate that for their families. And we're there just to listen as they share what they have learned, and they pass that to their moms, their dads, their grandparents. I have an event that's called the Community Activated Medicine Red Sands event, which is about raising awareness on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. I'm in my 5th year. I'll be hosting, you'll be able to join it virtually if you wanted to, for free. But we need spaces to gather, to honor our losses, to feel our hurt, and to heal together. This is radical grieving for radical healing, and we need to grieve for all of the losses that our families and our communities continue to have. This is what my programming looks like, Monday through Friday. That's that therapeutic web that I talked about. If anyone's interested, I can send these to you so you can join. You can join from anywhere because they are free. And we have silent grief vigils that are offered, and elders programming and healing circles. We talk about loss, which are layers of suicide, and how to deal and cope with the different levels that people come in with suicidal thoughts and experiences. We need touch. That's a picture of some of our families that we're bringing in, families that come together, because of residential boarding schools, because of colonization, because of the impact it has had on parenting. Things like hugging and touching sometimes has been wounded in our families. And so we have to learn safe and healing ways to bring that back into our practices. The number of seconds for a medical healing properties to release oxytocin and all of our happy chemicals is 20 seconds. Think about the last time you held somebody with good pressure for 20 seconds. That helps to activate those healing properties, those neurochemicals that help us to feel joy, to feel good, to feel belonging. Here, that's my daughter right there. You're going to see her. She's in the light blue and she's teaching. This is a couple of years ago, but she was the little sisters. They're all Native girls and they're all sitting there. My husband's Oneida. My husband's Oneida. So, and so my children are Oneida, Ojibwe, as well. And they're teaching our big girls how to do deep breathing and how to take breaks and how to do this for each other, so that when they see a friend who is having a hard time, they can reach out and know what to do for them. We bring our elders in. This is our elder Charlene. She's amazing. She's a culture keeper and a storyteller. And she came in and she just talked and shared with the girls stories. But when connection is currency, relationships are priceless. We need to be in community. We need to be with our elders. As Dr. Perry says, trauma has happened in a relationship. The healing must happen in a relationship too. And I'm going to close on this. I need my stories to heal. I need my songs to sing as I heal. I need to heal others so I can heal. I need you to validate my story. And I need to heal within my traditions. I need my mother's stories. I need my father's stories. I need my grandmother's stories. I need to know the preciousness of my body. And I need to take back all of the hurt and pain, to wrap it up and send it on its way, because I need to forgive. I need to heal beyond myself and within my generations. Mahalo for listening and for being here with me in this circle. And I look forward to having a little bit of a conversation if there's time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have some time for questions now. I think there's probably a lot of things that were prompted in people, and so we're just going to open up that window. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. You can also add it to the chat if you want. I can ask a question. I was thinking too about just COVID, and you were talking about the system and the environmental impact. I'm sure you get this question a lot, but the collective trauma we're experiencing, how does that sort of like resonate with your model, or maybe even update it?
Yeah, we COVID created, if we weren't already relationally deprived and hungry for it, with social media and the disconnection from being within relationships with each other, COVID just put that on a whole nother level. The impact of isolation and loneliness and feeling stuck is not just decision fatigue that set in, it's decision paralysis that set in. People began to just not know how to make decisions, what to do. And that state put us, as I shared with you, Dr. Perry's model of the state-based or state-dependent functioning, we have been set into alarm almost most days, right? And then we're in alarm, we're in fear, we're in threat. And when we stay there, our ability to make decisions that are responsive are limited. And the ability to have a sense of compassion has been, we get this moral injury that happens because not only do you have these historical traumas, and then you have these adverse childhood experiences that you're learning about, but now you have a global pandemic that has taken hundreds of thousands of lives and has impacted people to such a point where our elders, what we noticed was our elders were being forgotten. Because families were so worried. Our elders, because of our families wanting to protect our elders, they wouldn't see them, right? And so our elders were calling us. And so we had to up our game and we had to bring mental health to the people. We had to, my belief is we need to take down the paywalls and the gatekeeping, and we need to be able to provide healing at no cost to our relatives. That doesn't mean that the provider shouldn't get paid. There are other ways. I mean, for me, it's grant writing, it's doing trainings, it's creating a training institute that a lot of our services are provided by the students that we train here, and also by my staff that are more like field instructors, right? But it's about creating access to care. And when it comes to COVID just created a whole nother level of like disenfranchised grief. And so people are experiencing these different layers of grief and loss in just even what their work looks like, what their purpose feels like, loss in what it looks like for family gatherings or connections, what it looks like just to come back with each other into any kind of a space and feel like it's okay to be with each other. So there's so many different layers of loss that has happened. And so part of this is that what we're going to see coming down, especially in our schools, is that we're going to see the post-pandemic, which we're not in post-pandemic yet, but we're going to see the trauma, the ripple effect of the trauma responses in our children, because they have been, this whole time, they're getting messages, signals that are saying to them, hey, something's not safe, something's not right, we got to protect you, we got to, you're right. And so all these signals, and we have to do this. I'm not saying we don't do this. What I'm saying is we're going to have, this is a collective trauma. The pandemic is creating a collective trauma. And that collective trauma then adds on top of everything else. And so, we can't simply just minimize it to what we have in the DSM and say, okay, that's, that person's dealing with some major depressive disorder, that person's dealing with some generalized anxiety disorder, and even understanding, I'm gonna stop right there, because I can really get into how I train and teach clinically about those things, but I think I'll just hold off. And your question, I went off the rails. Your question was about the pandemic, and what we saw was an increase of victims who couldn't escape their homes, didn't have spaces to be able to get into, their perpetrator was in their home because it would be a spouse or a partner. And so there wasn't, the usual spots that person would go throughout the day, like work or the bar that was in their bar in their neighborhood or wherever that is. And so what we saw was an increase of domestic violence. And amongst our elders as well, we saw an increase of domestic violence, of 30, 40-year partnerships. And we saw an increase of sex trafficking. The work that I do is also supporting Indigenous victims of human trafficking and sex trafficking. And in the last year, we've served over 100 women through that experience, who have experienced that, and also supporting our families of our missing, murdered Indigenous women. That's part of our mental health as well. And knowing how to navigate that, helping with the search and rescue of that during the pandemic has been incredibly challenging to support families in trying to recover bodies and place their loved ones.
And we got a question in the chat. Many of your practices seem to involve being in circles. Why a circle? What's the significance of the circle, and what are possible implications for classrooms?
Sure. The circle is community. The circle is putting us in vibration and frequency of one another. So the science behind even heart math, if you're familiar with heart math, if you're not, look it up. It's really looks into our heart energy, right? And that frequency that we put out. And we can put out that heart energy up to 10 feet away from our body. You ever walk into a room where you can already feel if someone's anxious? Like, they're anxious. Like, you're like, ooh, I'm going to sit like 3 chairs away from that person because you don't want to absorb it. Or you ever walk into a room and you can kind of tell that someone's really angry or frustrated and upset, and you can feel that. And as Dr. Perry talks about, emotional contagion is his word. And we'll pick that up. And so that frequency, that vibration that people are walking with is going to impact us. And so when we look at creating community, we must learn how to attune not just to ourselves, not just to others, but into our environment. And so when we are in circle with each other, when we are connected to each other, we are creating belonging and community. The implications of that is we can get deeper into understanding intimacy barrier, which is another concept of Dr. Perry. And intimacy barrier is really looking at the, if you have experienced a lot of trauma through relationships, through caregivers, right? That somebody could look at you the wrong way and you're like, why are you looking at me like that, right? And you give them this like attitude and like, oh, they're looking at me, and then the kid gets all upset and they get frustrated and then they say F this, and you can cut all this out. You get what I'm saying though. They get upset and frustrated in that moment because somebody looked at them the wrong way, right? What we have to do to repair neurobiologically is that they have been given a script at some point in their life where when someone looked at them, it meant fear, it meant threat, it meant hurt. Okay, that's why they're responding that way. Something in their neurobiological signaling is saying, hey, orient to this, someone's looking at you a certain way. This is why when we think about coming into circle, it's so important to be able to teach our children how to recognize when they need to have healing practices for themselves, how to share it with their peers, how to recognize it in their peers, and to be able to communicate it in a good way. And when we're in circle, what we're able to do is, as the adults in that space, we can help model and mentor and guide them when they are in those spaces. I really don't see huge implications in being in a circle. You're already in chairs and desks, right? They're already next to each other. And so being in circle shows them they are in community, that they belong to each other. And then it also shows them that they have a responsibility to one another. Sometimes the families in which we come from, they can't be there for us in the way that we need them to. And I'm not blaming or shaming them for that, because I don't know their stories. But we can teach community in our schools. We can teach belonging in our schools. We can see each other in our schools. Our mirror neurons will fire, right? If we're having empathy, someone stubs their toe, part of my brain's going to light up that says, ow. But if I'm not looking at you and I'm facing a teacher and I'm looking up just this way, my ability to access neurobiological responses to others is going to be limited because my peripherals are over here like this. When we see each other in circle, I now need to pay attention. I need to feel. I need to be present. These are skills that we can teach our children so they learn how to take care of not just themselves, their peers. They can bring that back to their families. So the implications of having a circle, I guess it means more training, right? For the educators, that would be one. Part of it would be learning about their own vicarious or secondary trauma experiences that might happen if they're working with in that state. We talk about social and emotional learning all the time, but what does that really mean? It goes beyond the individual. Social and emotional learning is understanding our space, our place in space with others. When we know we matter, we show up. If we think no one's going to miss us, we might not. Being in circle makes everyone know that they matter.
So true. And Godwin made a connection in the chat to the restorative justice circle practice that we have too.
So restorative justice, can I just make a comment about restorative justice? So restorative justice is that practice, right, of you and I, there's something that needs to be repaired, right? There's something that maybe we need to connect on. Then there's transformative justice, which is looking at more of that social justice lens and saying, you know, it's more not just that something bad maybe happened between me and another student, and maybe I need to kind of like be in circle and connect with that person. But we also have to understand maybe the systems at play, like I'm talking about historical trauma. But talking circles from an Indigenous perspective are matriarchal, which means that all voices are needed, all voices are included, all genders are represented. It's understanding what it means to be within ancestral and community teachings. It goes beyond restorative justice and transformative justice, and it demands that we change the way in which our children learn how to make decisions, how they govern, how they lead within shared leadership. When I say matriarchal, I'm not just referring to women in the sense that we're looking at, I'm talking about not just cisgendered women, right? I'm looking at our two-spirit relatives, our indigiqueer relatives. I'm looking at our trans women. I'm looking at everybody, saying that when we can protect our women and our children and come into circle with each other, we protect the whole. Moving from a patriarchal narrative to a matriarchal narrative means that we're in circle with each other. It means I have to take time to listen to you, to navigate that space, to hold space and know when to take up space. That's a skill. To know how to hold space for others and how to take up space for yourself. So restorative justice Transformative justice, those are more Western concepts that have been more recently developed. The talking circles that are Indigenous people, which I am not the only one. There are so many people that can talk to you and teach to you what Indigenous circles look like. However, what I want to say is that there's not one voice ever. There is not. I will always defer to the elders in my circle. And unfortunately, because of historical trauma and residential schools that they've experienced, they might not know either. So we're learning together.
Well, we wish we could give you a huge hug, deep one for 20 seconds at least, to say a big mahalo. So we give you a virtual hug and thanking you for prompting so many wonderful concepts today. And we are going to need time to process, like you said, more than just 2 hours. So we have sent the books out, and this is sort of like a kickoff of what we can look forward to as we dive deeper. We're going to be holding space at the end of September, sending a follow-up for more of a breakout style for people to show up thinking about their own stories and connections, like the one I shared at the beginning where I saw the boy who has really felt safe at school. Like Oprah said, school was the safe place for her. So as I'm reading the book and I'm making connections to what I see, you know, in our own unique context, we're going to invite people to come back in a month to share your own connections and context as well. So you know, just receiving the book, hopefully this got you excited to want to dive in and read more, and we'll welcome and open up an invite to come back for others to share and a more ongoing interactive conversation as well. So we thank you so much because you helped us to build some context and schema for which to dive into the book and to learn more resources. And we are so appreciative of your energy today. Thank you, Lea.
Yeah, mahalo for inviting me. I really appreciate to be in this circle with you all. We've created a circle here today, and you know, there's not one voice on all of this stuff, but when we think about our communities and what they've experienced, we have to go beyond just what happened to one person, but to understand what happened to the whole. And that will be part of our healing. So mahalo nui loa to everybody, and please reach out to me. I am available if you want to ever connect.